Come closer and listen. Let the noise of the modern world fall away, and let us travel back in time. Back to a city of stark and terrible contrasts, to the London of 1888. This was the pinnacle of the British Empire, a glittering jewel of industry, wealth, and power. But like all brilliant jewels, it cast a long, dark shadow. And in that shadow, in the sprawling, impoverished warren of London's East End, a story was about to be written in blood. Our setting is Whitechapel. Imagine it not as a place on a map, but as a living, breathing creature of despair. The air is a thick, yellow concoction of coal smoke, river fog, and the stench of tanneries and slaughterhouses, a perpetual gloom that clings to the cobbled streets and seeps through the cracks of crumbling brick tenements. The nights are lit by the flickering, unreliable glow of gas lamps, which do more to create dancing, monstrous shadows than to illuminate the way. This is a labyrinth of over 10,000 narrow streets, courts, and unlit alleyways, a place where a person could vanish without a trace. It is a world of gin-soaked poverty, of overcrowded doss houses where a soul can rent a bed, or even just a length of rope to lean against, for a few pence. It is a world of desperation, where thousands of women, forgotten by society, are forced to walk the streets at night, selling the only thing they have left to sell, just to survive until the next sunrise. And it was into this forgotten world in the autumn of that year that a predator of unnatural cunning and cruelty began his hunt. He moved like a ghost through the fog, a faceless phantom with a sharp knife and an unholy purpose. This is the story of the 5 women he chose and the legend of terror he created. This is the story of Jack the Ripper. The first blood. The murder of Polly Nichols. The terror began in the darkest hours of August 31st. Mary Ann Nichols, known to all as Polly, was 43 years old, a mother of 5, whose life had unraveled into a sad tapestry of alcoholism and poverty. That night, she was turned away from her lodging house on Thrall Street. She didn't have the 4pence for a bed. "Never mind," she told the deputy, a touch of bravado in her voice. "I'll soon get my doss money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." It was a small, black straw bonnet, trimmed with velvet, a pathetic scrap of dignity in a life that had been stripped of it. She walked out into the night, into the labyrinth of Whitechapel, and was never seen alive by anyone who knew her again. At approximately 3:40 a.m., 2 men on their way to work, Charles Cross and Robert Paul, were walking down the dark and deserted Bucks Row. In the gloom, they saw a bundle lying on the ground near a stable entrance. As they drew closer, they saw it was a woman, her skirts hitched up around her waist. Thinking she was simply drunk and passed out, a common enough sight, Cross touched her. Her face felt warm, but her hands were cold and limp. Unsettled, the men straightened her skirts and continued on their way, deciding to alert the first constable they met. Minutes later, Police Constable John Neal, on his routine patrol, discovered the same woman. He lit his bullseye lantern, and the focused beam fell upon her face. Her eyes were wide open, staring up into the dark sky with a glassy, unseeing emptiness. He felt for a pulse. There was none. She was dead. It was only when a surgeon, Dr. Rhys Llewellyn, was summoned to the scene that the true, unspeakable horror of Polly Nichols's death was revealed. Her throat had been slashed with 2 deep, violent cuts, one of which had severed her windpipe, spine, and major arteries. She was so nearly decapitated that her head lolled back grotesquely. But the killer had not stopped there. With the same blade, he had inflicted a series of jagged, deep wounds across her lower abdomen, tearing her flesh open. The doctor estimated she had been dead for less than 30 minutes. The killer had struck with terrifying speed and silence, and then, like a phantom, had vanished back into the warrens of Whitechapel. Polly Nichols, who had gone out in search of fourpence, had instead found the monster lurking in the dark. The escalation, the butchery of Annie Chapman. At first, Polly's murder was just another tragedy in a district overflowing with them. But the people of Whitechapel would not have to wait long to understand that this was something new, something far more terrible. 8 days later, on the morning of September 8th, the killer struck again. The victim was Annie Chapman, a 47-year-old widow whose life had followed a similarly tragic path to Polly's. She was found in the filthy backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street, a grim, multi-tenanted building in the heart of Spitalfields. A resident discovered her body at around 6 a.m., lying between the steps and the fence. The savagery inflicted upon her marked a horrifying escalation. Like Polly, her throat had been slit with 2 clean, deep cuts. But the killer's true work had been focused on her abdomen. He had sliced her open from her pelvis to her sternum with a surgeon's precision. Her intestines had been lifted out and thrown over her right shoulder. The scene was a tableau of calculated butchery. When the police surgeon examined the body, he made a chilling discovery. Her uterus, a portion of her bladder, and a section of her vagina had been meticulously excised and taken from the scene. This was not a frenzy of rage. This was the work of a man who knew anatomy, a man who was collecting trophies. Witnesses provided fleeting, frustrating clues. A woman had seen Annie talking to a man outside the house around 5:30 a.m. He was described as being of shabby genteel appearance, dark-complexioned, and possibly foreign. Another resident, Albert Kadosh, who lived next door, heard a woman's faint cry of "No!" from the yard, followed by the sound of something heavy slumping against the fence. It was the only sound of a struggle ever associated with the Ripper's victims. 20 minutes later, Annie Chapman's mutilated body was found. The connection between the 2 murders was now undeniable. Panic began to take hold. A serial killer, a monster of human form, was stalking the streets. The press dubbed him the Whitechapel murderer, but his legend was about to be forged by his own hand. The phantom finds a voice, the birth of a legend. On September 27th, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. It was written in bold red ink, its tone a chilling mixture of jaunty arrogance and pure malevolence. It was a direct taunt to the police and the public, a theatrical pronouncement from the killer himself. "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. I am down on prostitutes, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. The next job I do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send them to the police officers just for a jolly, wouldn't you?" The author spoke of his love for his work and his desire to start again. And then he signed off with the 2 words that would ensure his immortality. "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." The police, inundated with hoax letters, initially dismissed it, but the name stuck. The press, sensing a story of a lifetime, ran with it. Suddenly, the killer was no longer a nameless ghoul. He was a character, a bogeyman with a catchy, terrifying name. Jack the Ripper was born, and he was about to prove that his promises were not idle threats. The Autumn of Terror. The double event. The last night of September was when the Autumn of Terror reached its bloody crescendo. On this single night, Jack the Ripper, perhaps spurred on by his newfound fame, would murder 2 women in less than an hour, an act of brazen audacity that sent shockwaves through the entire city. His first victim of the night was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old Swedish woman known as Long Liz. At around 1 a.m., a man named Louis Diemschutz, a local steward, turned his horse and cart into the pitch-black gateway of Dutfield's yard off Berner Street. His pony shied violently, refusing to go further. In the darkness, Diemschutz saw what he thought was a drunken woman on the ground. He nudged her with his whip, but got no response. Lighting a match, he saw the horrific truth. A torrent of blood was still flowing from a deep gash in her throat. Her body was still warm. He had missed the killer by mere moments. Elizabeth Stride's throat had been cut with the Ripper's typical efficiency, but there were no other mutilations. The consensus among the police was that Diemschutz's arrival had disturbed the killer, forcing him to flee before he could complete his ritual. Jack the Ripper, a predator cheated of his prize, was now back on the prowl, his bloodlust unsatisfied, his rage likely stoked by the interruption. He moved quickly through the darkened city streets, a phantom seeking another sacrifice. And he found one. Just 45 minutes later, and about a mile away, in a dark corner of Mitre Square, Police Constable Edward Watkins was walking his beat. The square had been empty on his last pass, just minutes before. Now, he saw the crumpled form of a woman. It was Catherine Eddowes. This time there had been no interruption. The killer had unleashed the full force of his fury. Her throat was severed. Her abdomen was ripped open, her intestines pulled out and placed over her shoulder. Her face was horrifically disfigured, the tip of her nose cut off, and deep, V-shaped gashes carved into her cheeks. But the most chilling discovery was made during the autopsy. Her uterus and her left kidney had been skillfully removed and taken by the killer. The next day, a postcard, also in red ink, arrived at the news agency. It was a direct follow-up to the Dear Boss letter. I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not time to get ears for police. The postcard's specific reference to the interrupted murder of Number 1 seemed to be chilling proof. The letters were genuine. The police, now desperate, released them to the public. The name Jack the Ripper was everywhere. He was no longer just a murderer. He was a media sensation, a theatrical villain playing to a terrified audience. A message from hell. The Ripper's correspondence took its most macabre turn on October 16th. George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local businessmen who had organized their own patrols, received a small cardboard box in the mail. The smell emanating from it was foul. Inside, nestled on a piece of paper, was half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits. It was accompanied by a crudely written, semi-literate note. From hell. Mr. Lusk saw, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you to the piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody niff that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Doctors examined the organ. It was a human kidney from the left side. It showed signs of Bright's disease, a condition from which Catherine Eddowes, who was missing her left kidney, was known to suffer. This gruesome delivery is considered by most experts to be the only communication that almost certainly came from the Ripper himself, a horrifying glimpse into a mind that not only murdered and mutilated, but also toyed with cannibalism. The final atrocity, the butchery of Mary Jane Kelly. For a month, a tense silence fell over Whitechapel. The public and police waited, wondering if the horror was finally over. It was not. The Ripper was saving his grand finale, his masterpiece of butchery, for last. His final victim was Mary Jane Kelly. At 25, she was younger and considered more attractive than the other victims. Crucially, she had something they did not: a room of her own. A small, squalid, 12-foot square room at 13 Miller's Court, a miserable cul-de-sac off Dorset Street, known as the worst street in London. This privacy would grant the Ripper the one thing he had never had before: time. On the morning of November 9th, Mary's landlord sent his assistant, a man named Thomas Bowyer, to collect her overdue rent. When he got no answer, he went around to the side of the room and peered through a grimy, broken window pane. The curtains had been pulled aside. What Bowyer saw in the dim light of that room would be forever seared into his memory. He staggered back, his face as white as a sheet. "My God," he whispered to the landlord, "run for the police." The scene inside was a vision from the deepest circle of hell. The small room was a slaughterhouse. Mary Jane Kelly's body lay in the center of the bed, but she was so horribly mutilated, she was barely recognizable as human. Her face had been completely hacked away, her features obliterated. Her breasts had been sliced off and placed on the bedside table. Her limbs had been partially severed. Her entire abdominal cavity had been emptied out. Her liver, her intestines, her spleen and other organs had been meticulously removed and arranged in neat, deliberate piles all around the room. Some under her head, some on the table, some by her feet. Her heart had been taken from the scene and was never found. The killer had spent hours in that room, working by the light of a single candle. He had dissected her body with a maniacal, anatomical focus, turning her into an abstract exhibition of flesh and bone. It was the absolute apex of his madness, a final, terrible statement. It was so extreme, so complete, that it felt like an ending. And it was. After the unspeakable horror of Miller's Court, Jack the Ripper laid down his knife and vanished. The killing stopped. The letters ceased. He melted back into the London fog from whence he came, leaving behind a city traumatized, a police force humiliated, and a mystery that would endure for all time. The ghosts of suspicion. The manhunt was one of the largest in British history. Thousands were interviewed, hundreds were detained, but the Ripper was never found. In the century since, the case has become a breeding ground for countless theories, some plausible, some utterly fantastic. The police at the time had their favorites. There was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher from a good family, whose body was found floating in the Thames in December 1888, shortly after the final murder. His own family suspected him of being the Ripper, and his convenient death neatly coincided with the end of the terror. There was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. He was known to suffer from severe mental illness and held a deep-seated hatred of women. He was a prime suspect of a senior police official and was eventually institutionalized. In recent years, controversial DNA analysis of a shawl said to belong to Catherine Eddowes has pointed to Kosminski, but the evidence remains fiercely debated. And there was Severin Kłosowski, another Polish immigrant who went by the name George Chapman. He was a serial poisoner, executed in 1903 for murdering 3 of his wives. Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of the lead investigators on the Ripper case, was convinced Chapman was the man. Upon his conviction, Aberline reportedly said, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." Over the years, more sensational suspects have emerged. Some have pointed to royalty, suggesting Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, was the killer, driven mad by syphilis. Others, like novelist Patricia Cornwell, have passionately argued the case for the celebrated artist Walter Sickert, claiming his paintings contain cryptic confessions. And some have even proposed Jill the Ripper, the theory that the killer was a woman, perhaps a local midwife who could walk blood-soaked through the streets without arousing suspicion. But they all remain ghosts, spectres of suspicion in a story with no final chapter. The truth is, the Ripper's identity is locked away by time. He was a product of his environment, a predator perfectly suited to his hunting ground. He used the dark, anonymous, chaotic nature of Whitechapel as his greatest weapon. He was a man who could kill in a public square and be gone seconds later, swallowed by the fog and the crowds. He remains the faceless man in the top hat, his collar pulled high, a Gladstone bag in one hand, perhaps containing the terrible instruments of his trade. He is the ultimate bogeyman, the embodiment of the fear that a monster can walk among us, completely unseen. His brutal reign lasted only a few short months, but he created a legend of pure terror that has never faded. He is a question without an answer, a ghost story that is all the more terrifying because it was real.